This is Global Order. I'm Hindul Gupta. Dr. Prakash Shah is joining me from London today to discuss the recent Islamophobia legislation that has been creating headlines. And now, this legislation has been in the works for a long time and been pushed by many Muslim groups. But now there seems to be significant pushback on this legislation, especially from Sikh groups. What's really happening? Why are so many people worried about this legislation? Should there be a Islamophobia legislation at all in one country? If there is one on Islamophobia, should there be other similar legislations for other communities, other faiths? To discuss all that, Dr. Prakash Shah. Dr. Shah, thanks very much for your time.
Namaste.
Let's begin by talking about the Islamophobia legislation. Why don't you take us through to begin with what this legislation is all about and its brief history?
Yeah. Well, at the moment, there is no draft of any legislation. So we've got to sort of just clarify that at the outset. There are all kinds of maybe suggestions flying around. I don't think there's even a concrete proposal that Islamophobia should be entered into any specific law by way of amendment. So I think it's all up in the air, and maybe people feel that there's something to play for here. But of course, should there be any serious proposal to get the notion of Islamophobia implemented in British law, I think there will be a lot of issues to do with the way in which that law could possibly be drafted, right? It's not a foregone conclusion that it should take a particular form. And in which legislation it should be reflected as a, let's say, technical term. So at the moment, we're in this sort of strange atmosphere where people seem to want something, but it's not really clear how they want it.
Many people believe that even though you may not have a legislation about Islamophobia at the moment, there's been so much conversation about this, Dr. Shah, that many councils at a level are already, in a sense, de facto applying in practice, if not in the letter of law, in practice, such a rule or such a regulation.
Well, that's true, actually. But by way of background, I should point out that what the local authorities, there's something like more than 50, 50 in number local authorities around the country. And they're led by all different political parties, except the Conservative Party, have adopted a definition which was laid out in the uh, all-party parliamentary group on British Muslims. That was in 2018. Now, that definition was something like as follows, that Islamophobia is rooted in racism and targets expressions of Muslimness and perceptions of Muslimness, right? Or perceived expressions of Muslimness. So what these local authorities have done is went ahead and adopted that particular definition, which is itself extremely vague. There's been a lot of criticism of it by those who've disagreed with what it lays out. So, for instance, it tries to link Islamophobia with racism, and many people say that, well, Islam is not a race, so why do you put it as a kind of concept which is cognate to racism? Obviously, you'll be no stranger to the argument that Islamophobia itself is an inappropriate term for what we might be looking at. So, are people, let's say, suffering from some kind of mental illness when they express Islamophobia? Because that's what the term phobia connotes, right? So you've all got all kinds of vagueness and problems with this kind of expression. And of course, there's been a lot of critiques. Of course, the largest set of critics have tried to say that it will be a bar on freedom of expression. And what it'll do, it'll also either criminalize. So if it becomes part of the criminal law, it could criminalize freedom of expression, or it could simply lead to some kinds of actions in domestic anti-discrimination law, which in Britain is a civil law, right? So you could either have civil liabilities or criminal liabilities, depending on what form you choose to implement this idea of Islamophobia. But let me go ahead and say also that it's not just local authorities, right? We've got to a situation where, you know, what Gramsci would have described as all kinds of cultural institutions in Britain. And I think it was Louis Althusser who elaborated on Gramsci's idea and said that, well, you've got you know, different types of apparatuses in any society. So you've got repressive apparatuses and you've got ideological apparatuses, which is, if you like, the soft version. And in fact, what you see now is a whole range of institutions within the society, both repressive and the ideological apparatuses, who've seem to have taken some kind of comfort in this idea of Islamophobia, in the sense that they see no problem in using it as part of their policy prescriptions and so on, right? So you know, any number of organizations are up and down Britain, civic institutions, cultural institutions, the media, and so on and so forth. They tend to use it as a given, right? So it's not as though we're not already living in a de facto sense with some kind of notion of Islamophobia in Britain today. We have it, right? It's almost as though there's an effort to make it part of our, let's say, common cultural currency, right? Which is, I think, of course, a very dangerous move, but that's what you've got, right? So it's not just the local authorities, but it's a whole range of cultural institutions. Let me give you another appropriate example, maybe in this context. At this point in time, you'll find universities up and down the country, they're opening, right, for the new academic year. And immediately you'll also have the celebration of Islamophobia Awareness Month, right? So Islamophobia, so, you know, you get students' union activities, Islamic societies, and so on and so forth. They'll be promoting this, you know, issue of Islamophobia as a problematic thing. So, you know, that also provides you with a kind of concrete example of the way in which cultural institutions, educational institutions have simply become used to giving assent to the idea that Islamophobia is a no-no, without seemingly also saying that this kind of notion is very problematic for the society, right? If we take it as some kind of normative prescription that Islamophobia is a no-no, what are we actually saying? But there's very little critique, you know, in the kind of, let's say, the arteries of these institutions as to what they're opening themselves up for.
Yatusha, a lot of people believe that if you allow something like this is essentially de facto preventing and silencing any criticism of any kind of Islam itself. And why should any faith really be not subject to any kind of criticism? This has a chilling impact. So essentially, what we are saying, many critics say, is that every other religion, every other faith can be criticized. But the only faith that cannot be criticized without absolutely risking an accusation of Islamophobia is, of course, Islam.
Yes, absolutely. And in fact, you know, you see it in the all-party parliamentary group's definition itself, right? So if you say there is an expression of Muslimness, what does that mean? Like, so basically you're saying that anybody who submits to Islam and practices Islam in the way they see fit. So it's actually indirectly referring back to Islam itself. And if you target that kind of expression, you're Islamophobic. Which means that it puts Islam and those who practice the religion above any criticism. It goes beyond that, actually. So the same report from the all-party parliamentary group of Muslims, it cites lots and lots of different academic studies to, let's say, bolster its case for, you know, having this definition and so on. So I'll just pick out an example of two academics who had written an article, which the report seems to assent, right? It seems to give assent to, let's say, the way they conceptualize Islamophobia. It's two academics, right, from Britain. And so they say things like, well, it's Islamophobia to associate Muslims with child sexual exploitation. So also known as the grooming gang scandal that you know has occurred up and down the country. And it's obvious that, you know, most, if not all, the perpetrators have been of Muslim background. female genital mutilation. Now, it's true that there are non-Muslims who also practice female genital mutilation, but there are large communities of Muslims who either practice it or they feel that it should not be criticized because some Muslims practice it. And of course, in certain groups like Somalis and so on, it's sort of a de rigueur practice. You know, it's a traditional practice which is also defended in the name of Islam. The reference is made also to Sharia. So the fact that, I don't know, it's sort of vague, but I read it as or I interpret it as saying that, well, if you're referring to the attachment of Muslims to Sharia in Britain, well, that would be a form of Islamophobia. Well, hang on a second. Repeated surveys have shown that there's quite a great deal of support for some kind of notion of Sharia, right, to be implemented in British law. So that's not, you know, I mean, why would it be Islamophobia to criticize that? Or an alternative reading is that, well, Sharia itself is objectionable, right? And so you could say, well, objecting to Sharia itself is a form of Islamophobia. Well, hang on a second. There are actually legitimate criticisms of Sharia, which have been expressed everywhere in the world, including by Muslims themselves. So how is that how is that if you like, a normatively prescribed no-no? Right, and so on and so forth. So, you know, the authors keep provide other types of examples and so on. And the average reader would think, well, hang on a second, all of these things are either associated with Muslims because there's solid, let's say, evidence or statistical backup, right? Or it's fairly obvious that there are Muslim practices there which are objectionable, such as the implementation of Sharia. Many people wouldn't want to live in a Sharia state. In fact, many Muslims are running away from Sharia states, right? So two states that don't implement Sharia. So that, you know, in all kinds of ways, you can say that, well, you know, these are reasonable criticisms. Why would you want to put them under the label of Islamophobia? And of course, given the current discussions, we're actually on a slippery slope to saying, well, legally, such expressions should be prohibited, right? Or should attract some kind of civil liability. Hang on a second.
This opens a Pandora's box, Dr. Shah, you know, because even among Muslims, you know, for instance, Muslim women behave very differently to, you know, being forced to wear the hijab in, say, a country like Iran, then maybe in many parts of the UK too. So, therefore, the Muslim community itself is not a homogeneous community. And as you say, some of this criticism, in fact, comes from within the community too. So, would something like this suggest that tomorrow, if a Muslim woman were to protest any form of oppression in the UK, which is being done in the name of religion, that would in fact immediately be called Islamophobic, which is almost farcical as an idea. But you know, one can see how this kind of Pandora's box opens when you push ideas like this. There are other instances, of course. You know, Britain has faced a series of terror attacks, and many of those attackers have been Muslim. Now, many of those attackers, if one describes them as being of Muslim faith, many of them use, you know, Muslim slogans or Islamic slogans, well, while conducting their attack, so to speak. If all of this is referred to, would that be considered Islamophobic? I mean, one could go on and on, but this is a real, you know, a real Pandora's box opens up.
Yes, absolutely. So with respect to your example of veiling, it's actually when I was doing some research for this talk, you know, things that I want to write in future. One of the things I realized is that in revolutionary Iran, women who object to veiling are described as Islamophobic, right? In fact, that's one of the earliest uses before, let's say, the British institutions and so on started to use this term, or in fact, well before some of the international institutions have been using it, the Organization of Islamic Cooperation, the UN General Assembly, and so on. You find that the Iranians have been using it to target women. who object to veiling. So your question is actually very reasonable. And the further question would be, well, what happens when a Muslim woman objects to veiling in Britain? Would she also be classed as Islamophobic? What's really interesting is that the two academics I mentioned who are referred to in the APPG report, they also say that veiling is, or let's say, presumably what they mean is objections to veiling are tantamount to Islamophobia. So yes, you know, I want to also cite you, before I forget, another example which has really worried me.
And even as you come to that example, Dr. Shah, it suggests that in a sense this recreates a sort of monolith where none exists, because presumably Muslim behavior in even in the within the UK can vary widely, from community to community, from educational background, professional background, all kinds of things. In a sense, by passing or pushing this kind of idea of Islamophobia, we are creating a monolith of really what is a very diverse community.
Yes. I wouldn't use the word monolith, although of course there's some kind of, what some of the critical scholars would say, some kind of essentialism about what Islam is, right? And as you rightly point out, that many Muslims in Britain would also want to object correctly, right, to this kind of prescriptive, norm setting, if you like. But rather than saying it's some kind of homogenizing, let's say, move, I would rather say it's a form of repression, which is rooted in the ideas of Islamism. Right. So here you have, let's say, Islamist bodies, right? Those who want to, let's say, have Sharia law implemented, right? So the so-called political Islam people, of which we have fairly wide representation in Britain, mind you. It's those people who want to, if you like, monopolize the Muslim voice and say, this is what you as Muslims should be doing on the one hand, and this is what we as Muslims expect from the rest of society. Why do I say that these are Islamist demands? If you look at the All Parliamentary Group, Party Parliamentary Group's report, it was actually, in fact, that particular group, that specific group, is provided by its secretariat. It's provided with its secretariat by an Islamist organization called MEND, Muslim Engagement and Development, right? And there's no doubt about the fact that, they have very strong Islamist connections. If you look at the Muslim Council of Britain, who has also been pushing for an idea of Islamophobia to be inserted in, let's say, some kind of policies and laws and so on, not many people realize this, but a book was written a few years ago by a BBC journalist called Ines Bowen. She mentions that the Muslim Council of Britain is an offshoot of Jamaat-e-Islami, right? And she even goes further. She says basically the Moduduist, like Marxists, it's a Moduduist organization. And this is, in fact, for a while, it was the most prominent Islamic organization in Britain. Although it formally represented very few Muslims and mosques and so on, it was treated by the Tony Blair government in the aftermath of the 9/11 bombings and also, sort of, let's say, the 2005 bombings in London as the go-to organization for understanding what kind of grievances Muslims had, what kinds of demands they had, and so on. And within a few years, of course, they stopped dealing with that organization, right? Because they realized that actually some of their affiliates have connections with Islamic radicals and also supporters of Islamic terrorism. And so they've stopped dealing with them. Now, if you turn the clock forward a few years into the Jeremy Corbyn era, you find that Muslim Council of Britain has, again, if you like, re-established some kind of channels with senior leadership of the Labour Party. It's not quite clear what the Labour Party official policy is, but certainly Jeremy Corbyn, Keir Starmer, the current Prime Minister, they seem to have warmed up to the Muslim Council of Britain for some reason. Now, that's all that is important as background, but it's also important for what I wanted to say, which is that recently I discovered that the Judicial Office, which is, let's say, if you like, a kind of, organizes training for judges in England and Wales, has issued a new version of its so-called Equal Treatment Benchbook, right? And the aim is very laudable. It's basically trying to explain to judges, how best they can approach litigants who are coming to their courts, how best they can treat them fairly, given the diverse nature of British society, and so on. It has a new section on Islamophobia. Not only that, it mentions the all-party parliamentary group of British Muslims' definition of Islamophobia. It doesn't criticize it. It mentions it as a sort of benign idea. It says that it captures, in the widest possible sense, the idea of anti-Muslim hate. Not only that, we go further. The Equal Treatment Benchbook also says, or it refers to, a claim by the Muslim Council of Britain about how Islamophobia is being experienced by British Muslims and so on. So what do you have? You have two of the, let's say, very prominent Islamist organizations, quite active in Britain, who are given uncritical mention by the Equal Treatment Benchbook, which is produced by the Ministry of Justice. It's actually what we call it in technical terms an arm's length body of the Ministry of Justice in Britain. Right? Now, go figure. What's going on? Right? How is it?
I mean, to me, it sounds, Dr. Shah, like this, in a sense, would weigh heavily on the mind of a judge when they're about to pass judgment in many cases. Will their judgment be seen? Will their opinion be seen, their legal considered opinion be seen as Islamophobic? I mean, in a sense, you're trying to nudge them into thinking that any sort of criticism, tomorrow if a grooming gang case comes in front of such a judge, and the perpetrators are mostly Muslim, as they have been in the past, what kind of judgment would this judge give is a question mark, because that judge has already been nudged towards thinking in a particular direction. This is extremely insidious and dangerous.
It is. And all this comes on the back of many laws we already have in Britain, right? There's some critics have said that you don't need a conception of Islamophobia at all, because existing laws which refer to religion, religious hatred, incitement to, religious hatred, or making abusive remarks which might result in some kind of violence against the particular group and so on, or members of the particular group. All those have found expression in British laws. Yeah, the anti-discrimination law, as I mentioned, also covers the protected ground of religion, right? So there's a variety of different laws, and in fact they've multiplied since particularly the Tony Blair regime. And so what's the argument for saying that you need some kind of extra special protection, right? Except if you take into account everything else that we've said, which is that this is, as you rightly also, I think, perceived, there is some kind of exceptionalization here of Islamist demands upon the British polity and legal system, right? It cannot be anything other than that. And it would go very far into depriving existing civil liberties and human rights protections to people in Britain, right? Such as freedom of expression, freedom to simply call out problems within society, such as the grooming gangs and so on. So that's one issue you have.
Yeah, there's also pushback to all of this, of course. But you were about to say something. Please finish.
Yes, I just wanted to round off the point saying that, I mean, we've got things like the Public Order Act, and also I mentioned the Equal Treatment Benchbook, which also mentions the term hate. The American law In fact, the Americans already have a draft law which hasn't been through all the parliamentary stages in the United States, in Congress or the presidency. So it hasn't actually come into become law yet. But it also treats Islam, it specifically mentions Islamophobia, and it says that it's a form of anti-Muslim hate. Now, one thing we have to be very concerned about is making laws on the basis that we want to prevent hatred. Right? Now, if you look at a dictionary definition of hatred, right, it has some of the stronger ideas, right? But hate can also include something like distaste. It can also include something like dislike. Now, are we saying that I cannot express a view legitimately to the effect that I dislike Islam? Is that what we're really saying here? So even some of the existing laws we have, which are based on hatred, or let's say the Judicial Studies Board says, or the Equal Treatment Bench Book says, oh, well, Islamophobia is just like, trying to prohibit some kind of hatred against Muslims. Well, hang on a second. Yeah, in the English language, hate has a very expansive definition, right? So while we are busy trying to prevent hatred and speech of all kinds and so on, we're also impeding on speech that we would not want to prohibit, right? So you've got major problems here. The way in which, let's say, the elites in British society, the cultural institutions, and all kinds of other institutions, the so-called ideological institutions, as Althusser would say, seem to have simply, relapsed to a kind of position of total non-criticality, right? And that's very, very dangerous, because what are you inviting? You're actually inviting the presence in the mainstream of British culture, Islamist organizations, and what they want. But yeah, sorry, you had a question, I think. Yeah.
Yes, as we come towards the end of our conversation, I have two major points which I wanted to discuss, if I may, Dr. Shah. One is, of course, this sort of thing will have a pushback, which it is already. One of the big pushbacks have, in fact, come from the Sikh organizations in the UK. And one of the things they've mentioned, because this is a historical problem also, this Islamophobia, proposed legislation or legalese, so to speak, suggests that, even suggesting that Islam spread in certain parts of the world by the sword, so to speak, is Islamophobic. But that's absolutely going against recorded history. And the Sikh community, which faced the brunt of this kind of violence, has pushed back, because their history is replete. I mean, what are we going to talk about in the battles of Guru Gobind Singh with the Mughals if we do not talk about the spread of Islam against quote-unquote infidels by the sword? And what were they fighting about then? And this, of course, in many other parts of the world, what were the Crusades, all kinds of things, issues come into play. Now, there is no doubt that perhaps in some parts of the world, Islam did spread via, the normal social engagements, through, tradespeople and so on and so forth. But there is no running away from the fact that there is a part of its history where the faith did spread via the sword, so to speak, via conflict. Now, this is just history. This is not attacking any Muslim today or anything like that. This is merely recorded history, saying that it is to be considered Islamophobic. And the Sikh organizations in the UK have taken very strong exception and have pushed back.
Yes, I think correctly. They've not held back, and they've said, look, there's certain of the kind of, let's say, itemized list of things that you might otherwise want to consider Islamophobic are simply part of our history. So how are you really, in the business of deleting our history? And so in a sense, it sort of chimes in with the kind of general tenor of, some of the wider societal movements that you see, where they want to just rub out parts of the, past. And you might say sometimes they're doing it for justifiable reasons, because there are things associated with colonialism and so on. But here you've got something which is associated with Islamic colonialism, which they also want to not mention. Right, so it's, in a way, it's opposite to you're destroying statues of colonizers and so on the one hand, but you're denying the fact that Islam also has its own kind of let's say movement, centuries-long movement of colonialism.
And Parsis flee their homeland, for crying out loud, right?
Yeah,
What happened to Zoroastrianism in its homeland, Persia, where it
Yes.
existed for hundreds of years? Was it all, was it all a peaceful, friendly conversation and they suddenly fled the country and all their temples, all that entire culture got wiped out? That's just completely erasing history.
Yeah, yeah, sure. And recently I've been reading some, snippets of accounts of how, Islam would also have tried to dominate the whole of China had it not been very, very, strongly resisted by the Chinese a few centuries ago. So you've got, it's not as if it's almost as though no part of the globe has remained unaffected by, Islamic imperialism or colonialism. In fact, I would go further. I would say that we need to now be taking very, very seriously the idea that we're actually undergoing some kind of surreptitious form of Islamic colonialism in Western countries, right? Once you have very key, let's say, Islamist ideas, but of course, some people might say, well, they're not Islamist ideas, it's standard Muslim ideas, seeping into the mainstream of society. We're actually accepting the ideological baggage of Islam as though it says something about ourselves, and that's what colonialism, in a way, according to the definition provided by S.N. Balagangadhara, right? He says colonialism is basically the taking on the account of the colonizer as though it's yours, right? And so, in a way, what is British society doing? It's taking on the account of Islam as though it's ours, and it's not, right? I would have wanted some other people to resist this sort of movement a bit more, though. You've not seen any coherent expression of objection from any of the Hindu organizations, right? So, as usual, the Hindu organizations, when it comes to addressing something in a confrontational way, they desist from doing it. Either that, or they simply don't have the intellectual wherewithal to even say some very simple statements like the network of Sikh organizations have said. So that's
What is
problematic.
happening, though, including within the Hindus, and you and I have spoken about this before, is that other communities are saying, well, if they get this exception, so should we. And, this whole thing about Hindu phobia, and many other communities are beginning to say that, look, I mean, if these are the defenses that are going to be so easily and so unthinkingly provided, so to speak, without questioning, without any deeper analysis, then why not protect everybody? Then there's going to be a competitive rat race, as it were, to this kind of exceptionalism. And, who knows where that might lead.
Correct. Yeah, you actually reminded me of something that I totally neglected, which is, yeah, one explanation for the reticence of the Hindu organizations is, or could be, that they're simply waiting for events to unfold and then continue to push their own agenda about Hindu phobia being recognized and so on, which I sense you also disagree with, but I also disagree with, right? I think that that's not the correct way or the correct route to take for Hindu organizations, if they're going to represent the interests of Hindus at large fairly. I think we
I
can
have a
approach.
broader perspective in the sense that, and we've discussed this in the past. Look, I mean, I think at the end of the day, all religions are man-made structures. They may have a divine spiritual element, and they do, all religions do, but they're sort of temporal structures, as it were, are all man-made. And therefore, all faiths and their temporal structures should ideally, in a civilized society, be open to questioning and criticism, because of course in many cases people who run these temporal structures, even if the structures are enlightened, the human beings may not be, and they use those structures for exploitation. Now, there is a long and extremely negatively illustrious history to this across faiths. Therefore, I find it extremely problematic that we would create these structures where nothing can be criticized about a faith. I find that very, very problematic.
See, I would probably put it slightly differently, in the sense that, you see, going for bans and prohibitions and backing them up with law actually shows a form of weakness, and it's a weakness of an intellectual core. And here I see, I don't want to single out the Hindu community and so on, but I'm going to, in the sense that you see a distinct lack of intellectual responses to criticisms that arise of, history of Hinduism or Hinduism itself and so on and so forth. And rather there is this tendency to take umbrage or offense and then go for the prohibitionist sort of line. And I think that's wrong. And in a way, my take does chime with yours in the sense that, you've got to have rational, if you object, then you should have rational rebuttals to criticisms which are made against your traditions or faith or whatever, and not go for the prohibitionist line. And of course, there are other issues there as well in terms of, we are not really a Semitic religion. And so, we don't have some kind of core doctrinal belief structure which we want to defend and continue to promote and so on, right? We're a set of open textured traditions and continuously developing and changing in light of historical circumstances. So, in qualitative terms also, it's wrong for Hindu spokespersons to sort of, depend on an idea which emanates from Semitic religion, which is highly intolerant.
Let me conclude by asking you one last question, Dr. Shah, which is, where does this debate go from here? Because, some sort of momentum seems to be building once again at local levels, and certainly now this pushback from the Sikh organizations. This debate seemed to have, caught fire a little bit once again. But as you say, there is no real, there's no sense where this is going to go. So in your sort of, educated speculation, where do you see this going?
My sense is that, pretty much like what we see with the Equal Treatment Bench Book, what you might come up with is, or what the British government might come up with, is some kind of soft law option in the sense of having, let's say, prosecutorial guidance, guidance issued by the Equality and Human Rights Commission with respect to the anti-discrimination law. That sort of thing may well happen, right? Because it seems like, as you rightly say, the pushback might be overwhelming with respect to having Islamophobia in a hard law form, right? And of course, the Labour Party is not unexposed, right? The Labour government is not unexposed. If you take it in terms of the overall electorate, not those who voted, but the overall electorate, it seems like only something like 17% of the electorate has voted for the current government, right? And their majority is actually quite thin if you look at the margins by which many of the MPs have won their seats. In the past, their margins could have been something like, let's say, 12,000, but the average Labour Party MP today has a margin of something just over 7,000 votes, right? And
with organizations like the Muslim Vote and others really sort of structuring and bringing about a particular kind of ideological voting, as it were, group voting rather than independent individual voting, all of this, of course, is set to get more complicated.
Yes. So what I say actually cuts both ways in light of your observation, because, pandering to the Muslim vote, as it were, and thereby, reinforcing the majorities that you have at constituency level may well mean that Islamophobia is actually pushed. They might not do it right now, maybe within the next few years, but maybe nearer to the election time, right? Or maybe they might hold out the possibility that that's done, so votes come in, so all kinds of tactical things that could happen.
Interestingly, with all the pushback and all the concern that has also risen because of this Muslim vote camp that has emerged, there's also a lot of discomfort in the sort of mainstream British society, and there could be wider pushback, of course, to ideas like this. Well, we'll wait and watch to see how that happens and pans out, and I'm sure we'll have many more opportunities, Dr. Shah, to discuss this with you. Dr. Prakash Shah, thanks very much for joining me from London to discuss this very important issue. Thanks very much.